interactions between gender and other inequalities, and I think probably continuing along the vein you've already opened.
Yes, well, I'm going to narrow down the first part of my presentation to income. Not because I think that's the only dimension of inequality that's important to look at, but I think in a monetized world, if you don't have money, then you are definitely at a disadvantage. Okay, so I hope to talk about two studies of the interaction between gender and other inequalities. One is from a recent OECD report, In It Together While Less Inequality Benefits All. Very interestingly, OECD, like the IMF, is now talking along these lines in a way they certainly weren't 10 years ago. But there's a chapter in that report that investigates the interaction of the distribution of income between households and the reduction of gender gaps in the labour market. I was talking at lunch with some people very often, in very progressive organisations, when they talk about economic inequality, they only mean inequality between households. And I think this is one of the challenges when we're looking currently at how do we grapple with these interactions between gender inequality and other inequalities. We can't just look at inequality between households. And thankfully, the OECD study tries to do something a little bit more complicated than that. And secondly, if there's time, I want to say something about a recent report from a group that I'm very active in called the Women's Budget Group that monitors UK government economic policy for its implications for gender equality and low-income women in particular. A piece of work that we've done in conjunction with the Runnymede Trust, which you know is a leading organisation working on race and ethnic inequality. And we did a study that looks at the impact of austerity, particularly on black and minority ethnic women in the UK. So I'll talk a little bit about what were the strategies we used to try and look at this kind of interaction. Okay, the central question of the OECD study is what would the Gini coefficient be if gender inequality in the labour market had been held constant over the last 20-25 years. The Gini coefficient is a measure that's used a lot to measure the overall distribution of income on a scale between 0, everybody has exactly the same income, and 1 person has all the income. So the higher this measure is, the more unequal the distribution of income between households is. It has been criticised, every measure, that quantitative social science comes up with is subject to various kind of reservations and criticisms. This one's been criticised for being very sensitive to changes in the middle of the distribution and insensitivity to changes at the top and bottom of the distribution. And that's why now a lot of studies use things like the Palmer ratio, which is the ratio of the income of the share of the top 10% to that of the share of the bottom 40%. And in Piketty's best-selling work on inequality, there's the top 10% and the top 1%. This OECD study sticks with the old-style Gini coefficient measure. The OECD countries, as you know, is mainly rich countries, but it's also countries that now, if you like, joined the rich club, Mexico, Chile, Turkey, so it has got some diversity in it. So if we look at the labour market in OECD countries, there is evidence that gender gaps in paid employment and in wages have been falling on average in the last 20 years. And the paid employment gender gap narrowed in all OECD countries between 1992 to 2013 to 16% on average. That's the percentage of males and females of adult age who are in paid employment. There is a wider gap if we look at working hours, because in many countries women are much more likely to work part-time in paid work, whether it's self-employment or wage work. What about the wage gap? No discussion of incomes and gender inequality can do without some mention of the gender wage gap. And among full-time employees, the gender wage gap has been falling in OECD countries. It fell on average 4 percentage points between 2000 and 2013, but women still earned on average 15% less than men. Occupational segregation persisted. We've had a lot of debate about how far this is due to choices, how far it's due to the kind of constraints and structural pressures that shape what jobs people go into. It has persisted, and it's really very persistent around the world. Those Scandinavian countries that were top of those lists that Anthony showed us, occupational segregation still very persistent. Their wage gap is less, but their occupational segregation still remains. So if we look at what's the interaction between these things, we had a situation in which there is this evidence of falling gender inequality or rising gender equality in labour markets, but at the same time, if we look at the Gini coefficient measuring the distribution of income between households, that shows a rise in inequality. And what the OECD, this chapter of the OECD study tries to do is look at the interaction between these things. It notes that the proportion of households with women in paid work has risen on the average, that women's contribution to household income is also risen on the average. And then it's asked, okay, there have been those changes, but supposing there hadn't been, supposing there hadn't been, what would have happened? And with those changes, what's happened to the Gini coefficient? And we find in almost all countries, assuming everything else stayed the same, that these changes, this overall reduction in the employment gap and the wage gap, have reduced inter-household income inequality below what it otherwise would have been by about 2 Gini points. So if the proportion of households with a woman in paid work had stayed as it was in the mid-1980s, the average Gini coefficient was have risen by an additional 0.8 points, from 28.2 to 31.6 instead of to 30.8. So the story is inequality between households has risen, but it would have risen even more if there hadn't been this reduction of gender gaps in the labour market. So it mitigates the reduction of gender inequality in the labour market. It mitigates, but it does not outweigh the forces that are driving inequality between households and the distribution of income. But look a bit deeper, and not all gender gap reductions offset increases in inter-household income inequality. The proportion of households with women in higher paying managerial, technical and professional jobs has risen on average. And by itself, this is associated on average with a small rise in the Gini coefficient, a small rise in the inequality in the distribution of income between households above what it would otherwise have been. And this is because women in high-paying jobs tend to be in households while men are also in high-paying jobs. Oxford graduates marry Cambridge graduates. So a reduction in gender employment gaps among the well-paid middle classes actually tends to increase income inequality between households above what it otherwise would have been. But that effect, which is like saying, you know, it's almost, you could roughly say, that's a case where increasing gender equality doesn't go together with increasing class equality, rather the opposite direction. But that has been outweighed overall by the fact that lots more women in lower income households have also entered the labour market. But the overall impact of more women in the labour market and the gender wage gap going down in mitigating the rise in inequality between households as these two different component parts. Now, this OECD study neglects to discuss causal factors. It treats inter-household income distribution and gender gaps in the labour market as exogenous. It just says, okay, this is what the evidence is on changing distribution of income between households, this is what the evidence is on gender gaps in the labour market, and it treats them as exogenous. It doesn't ask whether they might be linked. But I'd argue that connecting both of them are changes in the pattern of capital accumulation. And I think this is a structural factor that we